Yeah, so we're focusing on the American Chess Congress from 1857, highlighting some key moments in Paul Morphy's journey to winning the event. And his first opponent was James Thompson, and James Thompson was a well-known player at the time, considered fairly strong in the New York area. And in fact, he founded the New York Chess Club in 1839. And so the first game, Thompson has the white pieces. And I think this is a really instructive game, not only to give a good indication of Paul Morphy's style, but also how accessible Paul Morphy's games can be for the inspired amateur player. Because, how often do we see this sort of opening? Like if you go to any scholastic tournament on the weekend, you probably see, hundreds and hundreds of these games over the span of several weekends, right? And this is already an interesting moment. After the move knight c3, Paul decided to play h6, a prophylactic move, trying to discourage bishop g5, maybe dreaming of g5 in some circumstances. But we'll also notice a very peculiar idea associated with h6 in opening up the h7 square. One thing here is if black plays d6, which is perfectly fine, bishop g5, this is where less experienced players can run into trouble. And sometimes it indicates the source of the trauma behind why a lot of amateur players will play h6 before the bishop reaches g5. Because if you automatically castle here, now that your king is committed to the king's side, and the fact that your knight is pinned on f6, this is a wonderful opportunity to put pressure on the pinned piece with knight d5. And so black is in serious trouble because after a move like h6, trying to kick the bishop, white doesn't have to react by moving the bishop, and in fact can just play knight takes f6, with the idea that after gf6, not only is the g file blasted wide open, so the king's house is already looking quite vulnerable with a big hole in the roof, white can simply just capture this pawn, winning material, threatening the rook. So this is a disaster. And that explains why a lot of players, instead of playing d6, will play h6 to prevent the pin. And not to go too far into detail here, but I just wanted to make a point that after d6, you don't actually have to prevent bishop g5. But the big mistake is castling into the storm. Instead, you can play the move h6, forcing the bishop to declare its intentions. And if white tries to maintain the tension by playing bishop h4, maintaining the pin against the knight, we can actually break up this pin with g5. And this can often feel really scary, because we're opening up lines on the king's side. But since our king hasn't committed to the king's side just yet, regarding a permanent residence, this isn't such a bad thing. And if the bishop then moves back, for example, you may have heard the description, Capablanca's prisoner. There's a famous game, I believe he was playing against Winter, and Capablanca had the black pieces, and he had the same sort of setup where Winter's bishop was in for a very long winter, completely restricted by the dark square pawn chain. So anyway, just a little bit of an opening tip as we introduce ourselves to some of Paul Morphy's games, that Paul did play h6, but in truth, there's nothing wrong with playing the move d6 and allowing bishop g5, preparing then a timely h6. So, okay. In the game, Paul played h6. And then this is where we start to see white go astray. International master Danny Wrench has famously stated there's 3 opening principles in chess: development, development, and development. And he says it to emphasize how important it is not to waste time in the opening. So basically, you could think of it as new move, new piece, like try to activate your pieces as quickly as possible. So once we see Thompson start to play knight e2, moving a piece that's already developed and moving away from the center, it feels a little suspicious. There's nothing wrong with castling, and there's certainly nothing wrong with developing the bishop to e3, challenging black's bishop. So Thompson played knight e2. And one thing I always like to emphasize when working with students is to think about the space left behind. The knight on c3 was doing an excellent job controlling and supporting the e4 pawn, as well as fighting for the d5 square. So we won't really analyze too deeply here, but it's just worth mentioning that Morphy could have played the energetic pawn break d5, thanks to the fact that the knight on e2 has left behind its control over the square. And in so doing, black gains more space and opens up the light squared bishop and gives the queen a little more scope as well. Instead of that, I don't think Paul was too worried about the limited opening theory that existed at that time, and would often just play fairly natural looking moves. And here he just plays d6. So he's not trying to blast Thompson out of the water. He's just playing solid chess, and to some extent letting Thompson do a lot of the work himself. For example, wasting time with this move knight e2. But okay, Thompson wasn't a bad player, and he had the idea that he could use the vacated c3 square to play c3 with the pawn, and that means down the road he might fight for more central control with d4. So sensible enough. Morphy castled, and then at this moment, again, there's nothing wrong with castling. We could also mention this knight tour might complete its journey to g3, where it would support the pawn on e4 and start to eye squares on the king side, like f5 and h5. Instead, he decides to play h3, maybe a little bit nervous about a bishop or a knight visiting the g4 square. And this is where the game gets pretty funny. I think quite enjoyable. So far, we talked about the opening principles of development, meaning how important it is to actively develop and play just as actively and energetically as possible. And Morphy was always true to that style. Here, you might wonder what exactly happens. Perhaps Morphy had a 19th century mouse slip. The king moves to h8. And this feels a little mysterious, why exactly is he doing that? Well, in truth, he's still following his idea of trying to play as actively as possible. And we talked about d5 as a pawn break earlier that Morphy decided not to play. Now he has another pawn break in mind. He wants to play f5. And it's always important to think about pawn breaks in chess. Where am I going to confront an enemy pawn and try to break open lines? So in order to play f5, of course, he doesn't want to expose his king to the bishop's harassment here. And so the king steps to the side, and we're going to see on Morphy's next move just exactly what he has in mind. It's going to look a little mysterious indeed. So Thompson plays knight g3, as we mentioned, sort of one of his ideas. And this is one of those funny moments where if a beginner plays the next move, we would criticize black and say, okay, well, this is a bit optimistic, and you should, think about developing your bishop and then getting your queen into the game and connect your rooks and, centralize. But in the hands of the skillful Morphy, he plays the move knight h7. So for a beginner, we say, hey, this is a terrible move. But for Morphy, it's okay, this is pretty creative and an inspired idea. And, it's hard to look at the knight on h7 and be exactly encouraged by its placement. But it does eye g5 at some moment. But more importantly, what Paul's doing is he shifted his king to h8. Now he moves his knight to h7. And his whole idea is to play f5. And when you're playing an attacking genius like Paul Morphy, it's easy to sort of accept all of his ideas as brilliant and also good. And that's not always the case. So in this sort of situation with f5 looming in the air, I can understand why Thompson was a little bit afraid to castle. But in truth, he should have challenged Morphy. Just said, I'm going to play a natural move here, get my king to safety, come what may. Go ahead and play f5 if you want. Because the thing about the move f5 is it's double-edged. When we talk about Morphy being sort of this wonderful attacking player, emphasizing active development, he also would experiment a lot and to see, how far, he could bend the rules. And so he wasted time with knight h7 and king h8, which leaves kind of a strange impression. So in this sort of situation, when you play f5, you're allowing, a number of captures on that square. So for example, knight f5, bishop f5, ef5, and rook f5. As the smoke clears, Morphy's position is still pretty active. But notice he no longer has a light squared bishop to help join the attack on the king side. And the other thing is the rook on f5 and the knight on h5 indicate there's some weaknesses behind playing moves like h6, weakening the g6 square, and playing a move like f5 and allowing this capture. Because now we notice that this diagonal is a little bit weak. And so a really strong move here would have been d4. Gaining a tempo against the bishop, fighting actively for the center, and preparing to reroute our bishop to d3, questioning the rook, and then eyeing the knight on h7. So this would have been a much better path for Thompson, and he would have challenged directly Morphy's overall concept of this extremely energetic but somewhat risky play of just opening the king side at all costs. And as we'll see, Thompson starts to play quite passively, and we'll notice the king later would certainly have preferred to reside on g1 than the course of the game. So returning to the position after Morphy just played knight h7, intending f5. Thompson anticipated this and came up with a clever but maybe dubious choice, queen c2. At first glance, this almost feels like a random move. Like, why is this queen staring at two pawns? But as we'll see, he's envisioning the possibility of capturing a pawn once it reaches f5, and then opening up the b1 to h7 diagonal with d4. And my assumption is that he thought that this was going to discourage Morphy from playing f5. But true to Paul's energetic, active style, he looked at the position and said, okay, I want to play f5. Why can't I play this move? Because oftentimes what happens, with amateur players is, you see something on the surface and, oh, that feels bad. I can't play that move. And it really limits our options in an artificial way that can actually hinder our overall development. So Morphy looked at this position and said, okay, I can play f5, prove it. Just as Thompson should have castled and said, okay, prove it, Morphy, go ahead and play f5. And so after the move e takes f5, the idea is if Morphy captures the pawn, which he did not, knight takes f5, forces the rook to f5. And there's that similar theme we mentioned again, the rook and knight feeling kind of exposed on this diagonal. Thompson was ready to play d4, attacking the bishop while discovering the queen's attack against the rook. And of course, Morphy would keep this game incredibly complicated by sacrificing the rook for a knight, which then vacates, not vacates, but eliminates a key defender from the d4 square. And this whole position would get pretty crazy. But Thompson, certainly compared to what happened in the game, would welcome this possibility. So Paul understood that after Thompson played ef5, that he didn't want to enter these complications after bishop takes f5, and instead played the move d5, gaining more space in the center and also gaining a tempo against the bishop. So after bishop b3, this is where Paul decides to play an incredibly energetic breakthrough in the center with e4. And this looks a little bit odd, that the knight, pawn, and queen, the X-ray defender of e4, it really looks like, Paul's outnumbered in the center. But there's a big factor here that Paul appreciated, which is the king on e1. The king is still revealed and vulnerable, and that's exactly where you don't want your king as complications ensue and the center begins to open. So Thompson continued by exchanging pawns, and we reach the most important moment in the game. This is where Thompson would have to dig deep, confront some of his insecurities, from prior moments in the game where he feared his opponent, was worried about certain concepts, and decided to play more passively. This is where Thompson would have to rise to the occasion and decide, where am I going to make my stand? And just like how Thompson played Queen C2, just as Thompson played Queen C2, trying to prevent F5 earlier, Paul Morphy had this energetic attitude of, I don't believe you. I'm gonna test that assumption, and I can play F5. Well, here, Thompson has to dig deep and challenge the assumptions behind E4. So one point is if Paul plays, or if Thompson plays knight takes E4, Morphy's ready to play bishop takes F5, pinning the knight to the queen, followed by piling up some major piece pressure with maybe a queen on E7, develop another rook to E8, and then this is really bad news for the open king. Now, what's so hard here, and it's really hard to criticize Thompson, is his only path through is a move that at first glance you would say is impossible, or at least foolish. The one move you may never consider here is queen takes E4. Because after all, not only is your king exposed, now your queen is also exposed and aligned with the king on the E file, so Morphy can play the move rook E8. So we might look that far and just say, nope, not going to consider that, which is probably what happened. And spoiler alert, Thompson's about to play the really, really passive knight G1. But analysis suggests Thompson can challenge Morphy and say, okay, prove it. I'm going to capture this pawn. Yes, I know you can play rook E8, and this is a little bit terrifying. But the point is that the F pawn that I imagine Thompson assumed would have been captured earlier, well, it still exists and is living to tell another move. And in this case, with the queen, both of the queen and the pawn can support the move bishop E6, blocking the pin and buying some time for white's king to castle. So the reason we're analyzing all of this is just to suggest not only some practical tips, as an amateur player, inspiring improver, wanting to work on your chess. You can learn a lot from these games, not only based upon sort of the inspiring attacking play by Morphy, but also by critically analyzing these games, realizing, hey, Morphy's opponents didn't have to collapse. Morphy's opponents could have put up greater resistance. And I think that's good encouragement when you play a stronger player, is to ask them critical questions and keep a positive attitude. Don't just trust your opponent and that every move they're going to play is brilliant and sound, right? And so by missing this opportunity, we're just going to quickly see how Thompson's position collapses. So Morphy detonates this bomb in the center with E4. We said that there was a trade of these two pawns, and Thompson just trusted Morphy's analysis and played the move knight G1. And this is where things are looking really, really bad. It's as if Thompson is like really encouraged to begin a new game. He's already setting up all of his pieces on the first rank. And Paul Morphy doesn't have to be asked twice, much less even a single time, to activate his pieces and to play in a dynamic fashion. So E5 opened up, pushing the pawn from E5 to E4 opens up the E5 square. So Morphy pounces on that square, eyeing the D3 square, supported not only by the pawn, but also the queen. And after bishop E3, Thompson tries to develop a piece. Morphy parks his knight in the heart of white's position, knight D3, attacking the enemy king. And after king E2, Morphy makes an instructive trade. He exchanges the dark squared bishops. And the idea is if the king captures the bishop, Morphy is all too willing to pay that king an unpleasant visit with queen g5. And in the game, after f takes e3, Morphy played queen h4, taking advantage of the space the f pawn left behind and exploiting these weakened dark squares. Notice the queen x-rays through the knight, the f2 square, where it would join with the knight in attacking the enemy king. And so Thompson's desperate and decides to, since his knight's in so much trouble, and that, knight f1 would allow queen f2, forcing the king to d1 and then allowing a nice mate. He decided, I'm going to sacrifice my knight and remove the key defender of Black's knight on d3. And here, Morphy could have played, well, like Morphy, and played bishop takes f5. Development, activating his pieces, and threatening to capture this knight. Instead, he decided to capture the knight on e4, giving up his knight on d3, not because he was excited to exchange queens, but because now the queen can capture the pawn on g2, attacking the king, as well as the unprotected and undeveloped rook. And after king d1, there's nothing wrong with capturing the rook immediately, but Morphy plays an instructive move. Rather than sort of suffering from tunnel vision and only looking at the sort of materialistic perspective of just capture the hanging rook, Morphy, the master of time and development, captures the pawn with f5, bishop takes f5, activating the bishop, gaining a tempo against the queen, and also now opening up the rook on a8. So after the move queen e2, Morphy could have played once again a Morphy-esque move, which is just rook a d8, continuing to find tempo moves to activate his pieces, because by attacking the king, White has to deal with that check, and guess what? The rook is still hanging on h1. So that would have been an instructive move, but Morphy just said, enough is enough. I'm just going to take this rook. The knight is hanging. I'm ready to, and also pinned to the king. And I'm also ready to play rook a d8, centralize my pieces, attack the enemy king. So Thompson, being down a tremendous amount of material and having, shall we say, some pretty serious issues with king's safety, decided to throw in the towel. So to sort of summarize this game, I would say White was way too casual with his opening play. He was making sort of luxurious pawn moves like h3 and c3, and was wasting his time out of the opening. And although he still had his chances to, stay in the game and keep it interesting, he was just no match for Morphy's energetic, well-coordinated attacking play, which is going to be a common theme that you can see time and time again in Morphy's games. So he won the first match 3-0. And I should mention the preliminary matches, it was first to 3 wins, and then draws didn't count. So once you win 3 games, you win the match. So Morphy was able to do just that with limited resistance from Thompson. So now we're taking a look at Morphy's first game against Paulsen. So the battle between the two top contenders. And as we mentioned, this is not going to be a blowover where Morphy's just going to overwhelm his opponent. Although it's going to show from time to time, there's still going to be problems, but at least we know there's going to be a struggle ahead. Paulsen isn't going to just fold and give them the 3-0. Well, actually, technically in the finals, I should say, the final match, I believe it was 5 wins. First to 5 wins the match, draws not counting. And so the game we're about to look at, Morphy's going to win the first game. He ended up playing somewhat poorly in the second game, which I think resulted in a draw. And the rules at the time were that draws did not count. So then you had to replay the game if the result was a draw with the same colors. And I was reading somewhere, I think it's Zenon Franco's book on Morphy, where he said, we have to keep in mind these games were played without a clock. And I think game 2, he reported that the game lasted like 15 hours. and Paulsen spent 12 hours on the game, and Morphy around 3. So definitely, I think that would be filed under cruel and unusual punishment regarding playing one of those games. But anyway, this was their first game, and Morphy's going to transpose into an open Sicilian. The modern approach is to play knight f3 to help support the d4 pawn break. But Morphy decides to play d4 immediately. And after c takes d4, knight f3, he attacks the pawn. And there's an amusing little trap here that you'll sometimes see where Black will try to punish this move order. That is to say, the early d4 before playing knight f3. And the way that Black could attempt to punish this is to play e5 with the idea of saying, okay, I'm holding on to this pawn. And it looks like the pawn is hanging, but unfortunately for white, there's the nice response, queen a5, forking the king and knight. Now, in this sort of position, we'd have to embrace our inner Morphy. Yes, we're going down a pawn, but you could play the move c3 as an example, which would turn this into a true pawn sacrifice, well, reminiscent of a Smith-Morra gambit in the Sicilian. And the idea is that you would gain rapid development, and because the pawn is on e5, it can never move back to e6. So this light squared bishop would be prepared to slice through the a2 to g8 diagonal and cause a lot of problems in Black's camp. But in any event, that's just a fun little opening detail to know. But after knight f3, Paulsen played e6. And after knight takes d4, bishop c5 was played. And I believe it was game 5 that Morphy decided to improve on his play with the mantra of development, 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 and play bishop e3. Emphasize and maximize active development, rapidly develop his forces as quickly as possible. In this game, Morphy played the sensible but not as strong knight b3. The knight feels a little bit offside here, but it does remove some of the pressure, of course, the bishop was exerting, and it threatens the bishop. So Paulsen steps back, and after knight c3, Black would love to play the move knight f6. The problem, though, is that Morphy would be able to play e5. And in this case, there really isn't a good move for the knight, because notice d5, the space that the e4 pawn left behind, is protected by both the knight and the queen. So there really isn't a good option here for the knight, and that's why Paulsen played the move knight e7. And one thing to think about, the Sicilian is perfectly sound, one of the best openings for Black against e4. But when you play c5, and when you play this variation with e6, it's important to think about the space that these pawns have left behind. And notice that the c pawn no longer guards d6, where it did on its starting square. And the e pawn is also no longer guarding d6. So this means that d6 is a weak square. And this will be something that Morphy's going to target immediately with bishop f4. And then this is another example where Black needs to play energetically. That's the thing that made Morphy such a difficult opponent, other than just how talented he was and just his feel, for dynamic chess. But also you had to match his energy. You had to fight fire with fire. And in this sort of situation, Paulsen needs to play d5 and just embrace the complications, strike in the center, and see what happens. Now, here Paulsen didn't really sense any urgency and said, well, if I play d5, maybe my king would get exposed. So why don't I just sort of relax a move and castle? Well, that's an improvement over Thompson's play from the last game, castling the king to safety. But the problem is, Morphy wasn't just about breathing fire on the chessboard. In this case, he demonstrates really good positional awareness by taking advantage of Black's weak and dark squares with bishop d6. And I really urge everyone to pay attention to this sort of idea, because we're going to see Paul use something quite similar against Paulsen in the next game, the grand finale. And it has a lot to do with pouncing on weakened squares. And he's going to combine positional restriction with active dynamic piece play in the final game we're going to look at. But this is an important instructive idea that he plants his bishop on d6. He pins the knight to the rook. That's true, but that's not really his main point. The main point is that the light squared bishop is completely imprisoned on its starting square. That's why we said it was so important for Paulsen to play d5, actively fight for the center, and help this light squared bishop out. And this is something that's going to haunt Paulsen, for the rest of the game. After White has completely iced Black's light squared bishop out of the game and restricting Black's overall development, Paulsen really felt the pressure here. And now he should have lashed out earlier with d5, right, and made it as complicated as possible. So in sort of just a stage of desperation, he plays f5, right? Similar to what we saw Morphy play as Black, f5 against Thompson. But in this case, he's not going to be able to open up the f-file, which is what Thompson, not Thompson, but Paulsen is hoping to accomplish here, right? In a dream scenario, open up your rook and connect with the bishop and adding pressure against White's f2 pawn. But now we feel that dark squared clamp really tighten after e5. The rook is blocked. The bishop is now anchored by this rock solid pawn on e5. This is an absolute nightmare for Paulsen, and this ends up haunting him for the rest of the game. And we're not going to look at every single move, but we've already described what happened in the opening struggle. Paulsen played in a casual manner. He relaxed while Morphy played as energetically as possible. And now Black's position is just looking terrible. We have an entombed bishop, all of these passive pieces that are just slumbering. And so let's fast forward, let's say about 14 moves, and see how the position has changed. Okay, a number of things have changed, but a lot of things have stayed the same as well. Notice that Black's king is looking a little shaky. Paulsen lashed out with f5 earlier, which weakened the king side already. And now we're looking at this rook on f7, sort of trying to shelter the knight and maybe add some protection to the 7th rank, try to help the king. But notice this pawn on g6 is looking weak, and h5 is depending on the defense from this weak pawn. So positionally, this is already not looking very good. But as I mentioned, a lot of things have changed. A lot of things have stayed the same. Look at this light squared bishop and rook on a8. Because the bishop can't move, it's difficult for the rook to find any meaningful employment. The Sicilian is all about capturing, the pawn on d4 and opening up that c file, which can often be used, by say a rook or a queen. So these pieces are completely passive, merely observing events, unable to contribute in any meaningful way. And so this is still haunting Paulsen well into the middle game. And with this in mind, the bishop that was on d6 or b6, we noticed has moved to d8. And one of the ideas is to try to break this dark squared bind by capturing Morphy's knight. And so Morphy, of course, takes back. And now, because the pawn is no longer defending the bishop, Paulsen plays the move knight e8. And his idea is this pawn isn't going anywhere. So he's putting pressure against f6. And he's also attacking this bishop, which, remember, on move 8, planted itself on d6. And we're on move 25 here. And look at how that bishop is still being felt, in a very negative way by Black. So this is such a wonderful moment in the game because Morphy is playing in a positional style to some extent that we don't always associate with Morphy because he has, all these wonderful attacking games. But basically, this positional clamp and Paulsen's desperate ability or desperate attempts to try to create counterplay has resulted in this critical moment where Paul is more than happy to shift gears. No longer is he going to play as the positional anaconda, continuing to squeeze. Now it's time to light up some fireworks. So rather than continuing to try to find a way to defend his pawn or, do something that maybe doesn't ultimately make that much sense, Paul said, let's enjoy some complications. Let's dance. Bishop f4. He challenges the queen, and the queen really doesn't have a good move. The queen moves to h7. There's a fork. If the queen moves to f8, g6 falls, which we forecasted earlier as a weakness. And once g6 falls, that means h5 is falling. And so Paulsen is forced to try to fight fire with fire. And unfortunately, Morphy was really good at dynamic play. And to make matters worse, Paulsen is playing basically down two pieces, the bishop and the rook. They're just doing absolutely nothing. So after the move knight takes f6, Paul comes up with a really stunning idea. So Black's queen is hanging, as is White's. Now, when you're looking at this game, but also, when you're playing your own game, oftentimes you'll come up with a good idea, like bishop f4, attacking the enemy queen, in this case. Well, how often do you threaten something, and then your opponent just ignores you and comes up with another threat, like knight f6? This can happen all the time, and it can be really frustrating. But one thing to remember is that when you are the first to initiate an attack and your opponent is counterattacking, now it's your move again, meaning you can sort of direct the course of action here. Yes, you could take the queen, continue with your idea, but then there's knight takes e4, and you have to look out for moves like knight takes f2, and it feels a little annoying. But hang on a second. If I move my queen anywhere, like let's just say e2, not a great square, Black's queen is still hanging. So Morphy was able to recognize this tactical opportunity that attack, counterattack. Well, I'm still attacking. It's my turn. I'm going to sacrifice my queen on c6. A desperado tactic. The queen is ready to fade into the sunset, but not without doing some more damage. So this was probably a pretty shocking move for Paulsen. And notice by sacrificing the queen, you can't just take back and expect a good position, because after the bishop captures your queen, well, look at this. We have three minor pieces as White, and Black now only has two. So basically, Paulsen is at risk of going down a piece. So Paulsen tries to rise to the occasion and also plays a desperado queen move, capturing the bishop. And now we still have two queens completely hanging. But again, attack, counterattack. It's the attacker's turn. Well, attack, counterattack. Once again, the original attacker is on the move. So rather than capturing the queen and allowing Black to capture White's queen, Morphy plays another desperado sacrifice. Queen takes c8, and this time it's with check. So Black cannot continue any desperado dreams or continue to attack with the queen, and in fact is forced to capture the queen. And so now, after Morphy captures the queen, the smoke clears and Paul is up a piece, which is just a really cool tactic. I really encourage everyone to go through this sequence. It's quite instructive. And finally, Paulsen's rook that was imprisoned on a8 enters the game. But even here, even in the endgame, Morphy's not going to play passively, try to defend one of his pawns, which sometimes you have to do. No, in this case, he just said, okay, I'm up a piece. I'm going to play like I'm up a piece. These pieces are all, relatively active, doing things. I have a spectator on a1. Let's activate the rook. And so since Morphy is up a piece, there's no way Paulsen's going to trade rooks, right? Because then he's just down a piece. And this is a really active rook, right? So then as you are, behind in material, you don't want to simplify into a losing ending. You want to keep it as complicated as possible. So Paulsen does just that. He keeps it as complicated as possible by capturing the f2 pawn, threatens the knight, and, Morphy could play a move, like knight e5 or something. But instead, he says, hey, do I have to react just yet? Yeah, my knight's hanging. I get that. Let me pay your king a visit. And this is just a nightmare scenario for Black because, again, king h7 is going to fall into a fork here of the king and the rook. If the king moves to g7, White's rook has kind of sinister intentions down this G file, which is well supported by the move knight e5, attacking the rook and joining the White's rook in attacking this vulnerable G6 square. So moving the king is going to lead to disaster. Paulsen plays knight G8, self-pinning his knight, not a good sign. And after knight E5, Morphy's attacking the enemy rook while eyeing the G6 square, which will then pay a visit to the enemy king. And Paulsen's position is just completely hopeless, just collapsing. Maybe Paulsen, is forecasting the modern trend where you have these coaches tell their students never resign. So you'll often see games where players are down, a queen and 2 rooks or something, and pray for stalemate, and so they play on. And in this case, Paulsen tried to resist a bit longer, but Morphy ended up delivering mate, not that long after. So this is a really instructive game. I think the main thing, even the structure here at the very end, we can see that the C pawn and the E pawn moved. And of course, as Bobby Fischer mentioned, in order to get squares, you have to give squares. So this is a weakness that, sometimes happens in the Sicilian. And Morphy did an excellent job pouncing on this weakness. And when Paulsen blinked, he didn't rise to the occasion. This instructive idea of bishop D6 and anchoring that bishop with E5, I think is a really good positional lesson that we can take from this game, exploiting weakened squares due to pawn moves, and also recognizing that the game itself isn't always going to be won by positionally squeezing your opponent. At some point, complications are likely to occur, and you also have to be able to transition to playing, sharper, more aggressive chess to bring home the full point. So this was the first game against Paulsen, and we're going to finish our game analysis by looking at the grand finale game. I mean, one of my favorite Morphy games, in a game that I think can benefit everyone's chess by studying carefully and often. So here we are. I mean, this is, of course, Morphy's most famous game is the opera game. But this is one of my favorite games, and I think the most instructive game, and in some ways, in Morphy's legacy. The opera game, we all are inspired by it. You too can sacrifice your pieces like Morphy, but the result is often a bit different. That we sacrifice our pieces in an inspired way. We can't find the decisive follow-up, and then we just lose because we're down, a queen and a rook. But this is a game that, there's going to be some tactical fireworks, and even Morphy didn't handle them perfectly. But I think the opening and his treatment of the middle game is quite instructive. So if we think about Morphy as a good teacher for developing players regarding prioritizing development, playing as actively as possible, this is a wonderful model game. If we don't get, lost in the details, we should embrace sort of the essence, the spirit, the flow of his play. It's quite inspiring. So we see the 4 knights, and after bishop b5, bishop to b4, a symmetrical sort of approach, or a move that Rubinstein played, and I think Korchnoi also employed, was this knight d4. These are the modern moves. But so Morphy decided to not play one of these modern moves, but plays bishop c5, natural development. And this is a really good opportunity to think about the position a bit more, which is, okay, Paulsen just played bishop b5. He's attacking the knight, which is defending the e5 pawn. So it's always important to understand, when you play over these games, why didn't White win material after bishop takes c6? Does this win material? And it's important to capture with the d pawn, which opens up the queen. And after knight takes e5, there's a really nice combination here where Morphy, I'm sure, would have played bishop f2, attacking the enemy king, with the idea that once the king captures the bishop, this is only a temporary sacrifice, as we're quite happy that we captured with the d pawn, not only just to open up our light squared bishop, a good positional point, we've also opened the d file for the queen. allowing this nice double attack. So black regains material, and white's king is going to be stuck in the center. So this is not a good choice. So after the move bishop c5, this explains why Paulsen first castled. And now it looks like bishop takes c6 is on the menu here, because there's no bishop f2 trick, as we mentioned earlier. Morphy wasn't worried. He sacrifices a pawn now. Again, prioritizing development, playing as rapidly and actively as possible with his mobilization of forces. And after knight takes e5, we run into kind of a funny moment. Well, wait a minute. I thought he was going to play bishop takes c6, remove the guard, and only then play knight e5. Why would Paulsen play knight e5 immediately? Well, the answer is, if knight takes e5 is played, which is sort of the modern treatment for black, by the way, is to enter this line and play knight takes e5. White has what's called the center knight fork trick. And the center knight fork trick is all about removing black's central grip, the e5 pawn, attracting this enemy knight here, and then delivering a fork. And what's really cool about this position is after bishop d6, rather than sort of anxiously like, I need to recapture this piece right away, there's this move f4, which is beautiful. And the idea is that, yeah, the knight can move away, but now I have this pawn armada that's going to advance forward and fork the bishop and knight. So one line is knight c6, e5, and then either bishop b4 or bishop e7. And it's a really crazy game, but just wanted to mention that there's still echoes of Morphy's opening play that we can see today. And this is one of those lines where, black can allow this center knight fork trick and embrace these complications. And it's interesting play. But after knight takes e5, black has castled. Okay, so so after knight takes e5, instead of entering the center knight fork trick variation, Morphy just plays rook e8. After Morphy plays rook e8, this is such a difficult moment for white because white is up a pawn, and he plays a move that feels so natural. I'm up a pawn. I'm going to capture this knight and remain up a pawn, right? And we're going to see Paulsen has a nice little trick in the main variation. What is so difficult here is when you're facing an energetic attacking player who gambits material, a key resource when facing such a fire-breathing player is by having extra material, you also have the opportunity to return that material. So it turns out, instead of knight takes c6, this would have been a wonderful opportunity for Paulsen to play knight f3. Returning the pawn, if black is willing to take it, which black should, otherwise black is just down a pawn without any clear compensation. So after knight takes e4, we see some exchanges in the center, and now white can play d3, gaining a tempo against the rook, with the idea that once the rook retreats, then you can play d4, gaining a tempo against the bishop. And now after moving the d-pawn, the dark squared bishop has a number of active squares to consider. White has good control in the center, and overall is doing quite well. So this is an example where if Paulsen would have just returned the pawn and focused on natural and strong development, this legendary game wouldn't have existed. Maybe something else interesting would have happened, but not the incredible fireworks we're about to enjoy. So this is an example where, again, being put under serious pressure, it's difficult. I can't say with the clock ticking because back then they didn't have clocks in these competitive games, but under the pressure of, competing in a tournament game, it's not easy, to make this decision with Morphy sitting across the table. On the other hand, as we analyze it, we can learn quite a bit and remind ourselves we don't always have to hold on to extra material. We can often return it and transition it into something more healthy, as would have been the case here. Instead of returning the material with knight f3, Paulsen played a move that I think a lot of us can relate to. He just captured the knight and said, okay, I'm up a pawn. I'm doubling black's pawns. Notice Morphy captures with the D pawn, opening up the queen and the light squared bishop, prioritizing development even with the pawn capture decision. And here, Paulsen could have played bishop e2, which is a more solid option, returning the material in a favorable way. But Paulsen noticed he has this little trick. He plays bishop c4. And Morphy, of course, would never be accused of being overly materialistic. And in this case, Morphy is not interested in capturing this pawn. And it's important to understand why this is a mistake. When you play knight takes e4, or should I say before you play knight takes e4, you should think about the fact that you're initiating forced captures, meaning if I capture this pawn, I'm allowing white to capture my knight. And in so doing, my rook is attracted to e4. And now we have an example of loose pieces dropping off. Is the rook looks active, it's attacking this unprotected bishop, but it's loose, unprotected. So this would have allowed Paulsen the nice tactical shot, bishop takes f7. And the idea is that after king takes f7, now we have the move queen f3, attacking the king and rook at the same time. And so this materialistic pawn grab completely backfires for black. And understandably, Morphy avoided that. So after Paulsen played bishop c4, Morphy, of course, wasn't exactly excited to fall into a trap. And he decided to challenge the bishop with b5, which is an interesting choice. It's worth mentioning that here, Morphy's active development could actually pay off quite quickly. And one thing to remember is that when you castle, having a knight on f3 or f6 is quite useful in defending your king side, especially because the h-pawn, h2 or h7, can become rather tender once you've castled. You can think of the h-pawn as almost being the new f7 pawn or f2 pawn in the beginning of the game, where it can be a target. Well, here Morphy missed a really energetic shot with knight g4. And it looks a little bit premature because you're placing pressure on this pawn on f2. Okay, fine. But the concern is that, are you really wanting to trade your knight and bishop for a rook and a pawn? Well, one idea is that after h3, you could make this trade like so, and you don't have to decide whether or not you are happy with giving up your knight and bishop in exchange for a pawn and a rook, because once again, we see that familiar theme, loose pieces drop off, there's an exposed king, so there's this nice double attack, queen d4, attacking the king and bishop. Okay, so that's the first point. Now, the second point, though, that this feels a little premature is it feels like it walks right into a move like, say, d4, where white, is trying to trade queens. If we play queen takes d4, for example, and try to open up the bishop at the same time. But what's really cool about this position is that black can play queen d6. Do I need to react? That powerful question that we should always ask. My bishop's hanging. Do I need to react? And Morphy could develop another piece, threaten mate, and provoke the move e5 to, obviously defend against mate. And in so doing, now we can take the pawn, and black is up material, or not up material, but is regaining a pawn, and is now going to place a lot of pressure on this weakened e5 pawn. And one other tactical point I can't resist, I appreciate everyone analyzing the path not taken by Morphy. After the energetic knight e4, another option was queen e2, adding two defenders to f2, along with the king as a third. Well, now Morphy can play queen h4. Like we were saying, without a knight on f3, the consequence of this knight takes e5, knight takes c6 journey. Now, all of a sudden, h2 is tender. And after the move h3, attacking our knight, we can move to e5, centralizing our knight, attacking the bishop. And once the bishop moves back to b3, the reason we're looking at this line is not to just be amazed by these tactics, but to recognize how active all of Morphy's pieces are, pointing toward the enemy kingside, like so. Well, in this moment, there's the beautiful move, bishop g4. And the idea is, if white captures the bishop, now the knight returns to g4, and there really isn't a good way to deal with queen h2, threatening to deliver a mate. So I just create this as a bit of a mental snapshot that we can take, is that as black's pieces start to become more and more coordinated, as we start to feel more harmony in the position for black, and how all of black's pieces start to point toward a neglected white kingside, it isn't a coincidence that these lightning bolts can suddenly come out of the sky, like bishop g4. You take care of your pieces, they will often take care of you. So this is a good example of what could have happened if Morphy, instead of b5, which was played in the game, played the energetic knight g4. Instead, he played b5, attacking the bishop, and Paulsen retreated his bishop to e2. And his reasoning is quite good in the sense that after knight takes e4, knight takes e4, rook takes e4, those forcing captures we mentioned before. Now the bishop is ready to help support the king side in defense, as well as create some counterplay down the long diagonal against black's position. So Morphy, the master of combining as many elements to a move as possible, not just I'm capturing a pawn or I'm defending a pawn. He's trying to do the most with that he can with each move. He plays this multi-purpose move, rook e6. So notice he moves his rook to safety, and he's anticipating that he should probably defend the c6 pawn. But as we'll see, this rook may have more aggressive intentions by moving toward the king side to help a future king side attack. So this is a really nice multi-purpose move, combining defense with attacking potential. So now we reach a critical moment. Now, again, we talked about the importance of being willing to return material, or in this case, even sacrifice a pawn, in order to gain a reasonable position with healthy development. Because if we notice, Morphy's pieces are starting to feel pretty active, whereas we're seeing a lot of pieces here just sitting on the bench or on the back rank. One way to play this would be the sensible d3. And basically, you're just controlling the center. You're opening up your bishop to some active possibilities. And down the road, you might play c3 to then prepare d4 to restrict the enemy bishop. This is a move that I think we could all appreciate and probably play in our own games. I don't think d4 is as natural feeling, but this is also a strong move, especially because Morphy is gaining this lead in development. There's a possibility of a kingside assault. By giving up a pawn, black is still going to be doing pretty well, but we see these doubled pawns. We see, a little bit of pressure against black's camp. And in a situation like this, if Paulsen is able to queens, confront, the queen or the bishop, white's pieces are coming to life. And the main thing to remember is not to get bogged down with all this analysis, but just to notice that we're mentioning moments where white could have prioritized development, tried to be as active as possible, especially realizing white's lagging in development. These pieces are not looking very active. So that's one of the disconnects it feels between Morphy and some of his opponents, is that Morphy was always so conscious, so inspired, to always play as energetically as possible, to develop rapidly and effectively. And his opponents would often just seem to have this hesitancy. Well, there's no rush. I might spend 3 hours on a single move. Each move maybe it is not that important, even though I'm spending 3 hours on it. I'm not prioritizing development, And so in this position, Paulsen plays c3. Echoes of the second game we looked at in the Sicilian. c3 has the point that he wants to play d4. So if white were allowed one more move, d4 is great. and Paulsen's position has been solved. In hindsight, that's why d3, preparing c3, and only then d4 would be preferable. Why is that so? After c3, it's always important when we're playing our games to say, what does my opponent want? If they had another move, what would they play? Well, they'd play d4. But before we panic, we should also think about the drawback to this move c3. What is the space left behind? In order to prepare d4, the c-pawn has to give up protection over the d3 square. And Morphy was able to capitalize on this tempo, this moment in time, by playing queen d3, taking advantage of the space left behind, and now there's no d4 to be played. Now, this sublime positional move is going to set up some beautiful tactical fireworks. So once again, as you take care of your pieces, as you exploit your opponent's somewhat careless play, the pieces will often take care of you, and tactical opportunities may arise. Now, in this sort of position, if I'm looking at it as white and things are feeling a bit desperate, and I don't think Paulsen necessarily fully sensed the urgency here, this would have been a good opportunity to try to trade some of Morphy's active pieces with a move like rook e1. Of course, the rook isn't going to avoid this trade and allow rook e8. I mean, that feels pretty problematic, to say the least. And if he's able to make the trade, like rook takes and queen takes, then the queen can shuffle to f1 and offer an exchange of queens. And that's sort of the idea here, is recognize black has taken over the initiative. Black's pieces are becoming incredibly active. So when you're in a passive position, when you're being attacked, try to eliminate some of the opponent's active pieces. A move like rook e1, and if the rook's not on the e-file, a move like queen e2 comes to mind. But instead, Paulsen lashes out with b4. Go back to that second game we analyzed. Really good to review that, where Morphy had a bishop on d6, in this case, a queen planted on the weak d3 square. And Paulsen tries to lash out. And it creates more problems, though, because now, with the pawn on b4, this is not exactly a friendly signal for the dark square bishop, which is entombed thanks to this queen d3 move. Morphy could have played bishop d6, pointing toward the king side, which I think makes a lot of sense. He decided to move his bishop to b6, maintaining pressure against the enemy king. And after the move a4, Paulsen's threatening to trap the bishop. Morphy captures. And after queen takes a4, we reach a really, I think, instructive moment and a good reminder that, Morphy made his mistakes as well. His opponents weren't always as good at capitalizing on Morphy's mistakes as Morphy did against his opponents. But this is a moment where this bishop is placing a lot of pressure on the long diagonal. One idea would be to play bishop b7, defend this pawn that's being attacked twice. And although the bishop isn't exactly thrilled to be on b7, it does facilitate the development of the rook. So then Morphy would have two active rooks on the e-file. And as we'll see, there might be some interesting tactical potential once you double the rooks there. Instead, Morphy decided to play the move bishop to d7, which is as natural as it also is inaccurate. It defends the pawn, and it also allows the rooks to be doubled on the e-file. And the bishop feels a little more active here, because even though, it's staring at a pawn and it's staring at a rook, the second this rook moves, the bishop is suddenly going to be quite active in influencing the kingside events as well. So what's the difference between bishop d7 and the more passive-looking, but ultimately more pragmatic choice, bishop b7? Well, it comes down to the space left behind. I almost sound like a broken record saying the space left behind, but there's so much you can learn from that. We always think about, what am I gaining moving forward, right? What am I trying to achieve? We often overlook what we're leaving behind, right? The drawback. In order to get squares, you have to give squares. And in this case, we're giving up the a6 square. So Morphy allowed Paulsen one chance here to play queen a6. And unfortunately for Paulsen, he didn't see this move in time. This would have been a nice opportunity to try to exchange queens. And if the queen refuses, to trade, say moves to g6, then we can liberate our bishop, grab central space, and make this dark squared bishop a little bit restricted, giving Paul a taste of his own medicine, so to speak. Well, that's not the easiest move to find, and Paulsen didn't see it. He played this rather mysterious rook move, which can be explained, I guess, in two ways. Maybe he was thinking of queen c2 to force the queen to move, or trade queens. And if the queen moves away, then play d4, which is what I think he was probably considering. And also, maybe he also, in some sense, thought about maybe if he ever moved the bishop, he would lose a pawn. I don't think maybe that was as much of his concern, but that's one other element of the move rook a2. So now Morphy plays the move rook a to e8. And this is amazing. I say amazing because he's making a natural move, completing development. The rooks are doubled. But as we noted earlier, as black's position feels more and more active, harmony is being achieved with black's pieces, oftentimes tactics show up. So if, for example, Paulsen played queen c2, which is probably his initial intention, now there's this beautiful tactical shot, queen f1, forcing the king to accept this not so generous queen sacrifice, followed by mate. So this was a stunning idea just beneath the surface. And to Paulsen's credit, he anticipated that threat and kept the game going by playing queen a6, a clever move, creating an X-ray defense of the rook. And this is such an amazing moment in the game. Morphy spent some period of time contemplating his choice. And I remember hearing someone say 12 minutes when I first looked at this years and years ago on chess games, a 12-minute thing. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but he spent some time and recognized all of my pieces are participating actively in the game. All of my pieces are either pointing at the enemy king or influencing squares on white's king side. And so Morphy looked at the position and realized, okay, there's a lot of passive pieces here in white's camp, and even the queen feels rather misplaced. One of the key defenders is this bishop. So after careful calculation, Morphy unleashes this beautiful queen sacrifice, queen f1. Queen takes f3. Queen f1, of course, wouldn't work because instead of taking with the king, allowing mate, the queen would come to the rescue by capturing the queen on f1. So after the stunning queen takes f3, forcing open the g file, now Paul's pieces just flow beautifully. After rook g8, bishop h3, attacking the rook, bishop g2 is in the air. And in this case, if white tries to trade pieces, there's two really nice moves. There's rook g1, forcing the king to g1. And then after rook e1 check, the queen would be forced to block, allowing a mate. And I have to show you this beautiful move, bishop g2, sacrificing the bishop, but removing the rook's defense of e1, allowing rook e1. Black, of course, allows white to block, and then delivers this beautiful mate. Again, just seeing this beautiful harmony with black's pieces over white's rather scattered defenses. So after the move, bishop h3, Paulsen moved his rook to d1. Morphy plays bishop g2, forces the king to g1, and now we have bishop takes f3. Discovering the rook's attack against the king while also eyeing the rook on d1. But after king f1, Morphy was not focusing on capturing a rook. He sacrificed a queen after all. So this isn't just about material. We have a bishop on f3. We have a dark squared bishop on b6. We have these two rooks. They're all working together to create a lot of pressure around the enemy king, like so. Now, this is where Morphy could have really taken advantage of his harmony in the position and played the move rook g2. And in this case, he's threatening to take the pawn on f2. So if, for example, white plays d4, revealing the rook's defense of f2, well, then he could just take on h2 with mate to follow. which is pretty nice detail. And after rook g2, if rook e1 is attempted, now there's rook f2, taking advantage of the bishop's defense of the rook, forcing the king over to e1 or to g1, excuse me. Then we take the rook on e1 with mate to follow. So he missed rook g2, which is the most efficient mate. But he also realized, hey, worst case scenario, obviously I can play bishop g2, force the king back to g1, and he could repeat moves and take a draw. He does play bishop h3, but I assure you not because he wants to accept a draw. Forces the king over to h1. So notice that bishop dance. He captured a pawn. He moved to f3, discovered the rook's attack. Then the bishop swings back this way. And what has happened is the king has been forced into the corner. And so now Paul invites another piece to the attacking party. Bishop takes f2, threatening a beautiful mate on g2. So in desperation, Paulsen plays queen f1 and returns his queen, hoping to avoid mate. So after bishop takes f1, rook takes f1, we have one more piece that needs to get active, rook e2. And he defends the bishop, and as we'll see, he's going to create a new focal point for attack. He's looking at the potential of the rook, placing pressure on h2, and that's exactly what's going to happen. Paulsen plays the slow move, rook a1, and his hope is that after the move rook h6, because I guess I should have mentioned, by the way, the d pawn's pinned. So if he moves the d pawn, the rook falls. So he plays this slightly more passive approach, moving the rook to a1, in order to play d4 in, oh yeah, there's a bishop I want to develop. Too little too late, I'm afraid, for Paulsen, because there's rook h6. And after the move d4, grabbing space, opening up the bishop, threatening the rook on h6, this is all well met by bishop b3. Blocking the bishop and opening up the attack against the pawn on h2. This time, Paulsen was ready to throw in the towel, but if he would have captured on e3, the game would end with rook h taking h2, forcing the king to g1, and then the grand finale, rook e to g2, mate. So in my view, this is one of the most inspiring Morphy games, prioritizing active development, piece harmony, and also, if there's a move to remember, of course, we'll all remember this beautiful queen sacrifice. But how did the queen get there? How did the queen have the opportunity to make this grand exit from the board? Well, it's all because of the positional inaccuracy, c3, and Morphy's excellent positional judgment of taking advantage of the space left behind with queen d3. By paralyzing Paulsen's queen side, this is what allowed Morphy to rapidly develop with bishop d7, doubling the rooks on the e-file, and only then was he ready to sacrifice the queen. So really good positional play that turned into just an eternal sort of attacking theme that we can continue to enjoy. And I've looked at this game many times, and I always just really love exploring this game and watching the events unfold, because it's just a very inspiring and beautiful game. And this is like a really good example too, when you mentioned about learning from master games, is that you'll run into players who play moves like c3 because they're only thinking about what they're going to do. Oh, I'm going to play d4 next, so that's why I'm playing c3. And they never think about the potholes they're creating, like this glaring hole on d3. And so that's one way you can really learn from these games and put your opponents under pressure, because these are the sort of things both sides can overlook.